Good morning, everyone. We're continuing with our series of how to work with people based on Swami's wonderful guidebook, The Art of Supportive Leadership. Let's start with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your guiding consciousness, Swamiji. Give us the strength to live as you lived, in total dedication to being a disciple, in attunement with God's will, with unrelenting determination to live according to inner guidance and to serve Master's great mission of self-realization for all. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om peace. Amen. So, we are in the chapter 2 of the book, which is called Leadership is Not an Ego Game. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? So, this is about people in positions of leadership, but we all find ourselves subject to these delusions, so it transfers pretty easily. So Swami writes, egocentricity is invariably self-defeating. While it seeks only self-gratification, it closes off the very channels by which it might achieve true fulfillment, self-expansion, progress, and creativity. So what he's saying is when we're too concerned about ourselves, and then our focus becomes so narrowly on the narrowest definition of self-interest, the problem is that it doesn't work. And see, this is the problem with all of delusion. It's not that there's like God standing on a cloud somewhere ready to strike us down with lightning. The problem is it's not the way that we're made. And the more we become self-involved and concerned about self and asserting the self, the more shrunken we become, and shrinking is not where our true fulfillment lies. Our true fulfillment lies because of the way we're made in self-expansion. So this is what he says. True fulfillment comes through self-expansion progress, meaning an expansion of awareness and creativity. If a leader glories in the importance of his position, he will infect, which is a very good word, he will infect his subordinates with the same attitude. Swamiji has often, just commented, you can tell about an organization by the people who are in it. You can tell the spirit of an ashram by the way the devotees behave. It goes all the way up into the scriptures, and it says all of Krishna's soldiers looked like Krishna. And what that means is they were all in tune with his consciousness, and therefore their vibration was the same as his. I've had experience with ashrams and with Ananda and with Self-Realization Fellowship. We follow, both of those groups follow the same masters, but we have different vibrations because we follow the spirit of the leadership of the organizations that we're in. So you will infect your subordinates with the same attitude. If you're always preening yourself on position, you will attract people who have the same mindset, and it will become the culture of your organization. So you will have lots of isolated entities all competing for importance. And then never will he be able then to inspire in them the dedication which can bring a project to success. everything he attempts to accomplish must eventually bog down in incompetence and, unless its sights are set almost at ground level, in failure. Because creativity, progress, happens when the dynamics of human cooperation are properly followed. So if one is in a position of leadership, of influence of any kind, you have to have the self-honesty to ask yourself, what is really motivating me? Am I trying from this position to get a sort of external confirmation of my self-worth? Am I enjoying the importance of this? And then be honest enough to look at the organization or the people who are working with you and see if you are also having to fight constant battles of petty egotism. And you can look to the source. It always comes from the source. For the tenor of every group endeavor is always a reflection of the spirit of its leadership. I mean, that just says it just exactly. It's very interesting because when Swamiji was setting the guidelines for Ananda's future after he passed, he wrote a document called the Will and Testament, I think, of Swami Kriyananda, which is a great document. You can find it online. It's beautiful. And I'm not exactly quite sure whether it's written in there, but he talked about it in another place, which is he wanted there to be always one recognized spiritual director of Ananda worldwide. And once he started the Nayaswami order, and we had this idea of independent swamis and lots of other issues, the question came back, why would you want to have one leader? And Swami made it very clear, unlike some spiritual organizations where whoever is president is considered to be the most advanced person in the organization, and they have pope-like infallibility, or they are the Pope and they have infallibility, but that there is a sameness to position and spiritual advancement. Swami has spoken specifically that he never wants spirituality to be defined by position. Spirituality should be defined by the self-evident magnetism of the individual. A person in a position obviously should have some depth of spirituality, but it's not a contest, and it's not a linear progression. But the person who has the position of spiritual director has certain responsibilities, and we pray that they will always be worthy of those responsibilities. But what Swami was saying is, he said, we always need a clear example of what the ideal Ananda devotee is. In other words, what does it mean to be part of Ananda? And he said, without a single defining example of the essential characteristics of that, he said the example could become diffuse. But he said from that clear example, we can perceive the same qualities in many other people and respect them for their qualities, but it will stay cleaner and more discernible and less diluted that way. And so I think at the present time of Jyotish, who was appointed Swami's successor, and Devi, his wife, and together they serve in the position of directors of Ananda. And their characteristics are so self-evident that we may not even realize, how much they're defining. First of all, they carry their responsibility. They hold their position very lightly. And I don't mean they aren't committed, because they're fully committed. But they hold the position lightly. They don't go around reminding everyone that, after all, this is my position and you need to listen to me because this is my position. In fact, as much as is possible, they minimize, the accoutrements and the sort of ceremony. They're just extremely natural, extremely humble, extremely relaxed, and it's about that aspect of it. And it's quite clear that their self-worth, or that they don't need to assert position in order to, there's nothing in it for them. They're not trying to get their self-worth from the position that they hold. They're also very humorous. And of course, being witty isn't necessarily a requirement, but they're humorous in the sense that it's easy for them to see the light side of life. They're not over serious. They don't feel, well, we're devotees, we have to be serious all the time. We're devotees, but that should make us joyful. That should make us lighthearted. That should mean that we're always ready to see that this is a passing show for our education and entertainment. They're completely dedicated, however, to their responsibilities. None of this humility or inclination, capacity to be lighthearted means that they're casual about what God has given them to do. But their reason for taking it seriously is because they feel it's a God-appointed duty. And it's Divine Mother that they're trying to please. It's Master that they're trying to please. Their focus is not on making everybody around them satisfied and happy, although, of course, a natural part of the job is to keep harmony. But you can feel that they're doing it for God. And this, again, shows us what an Ananda devotee, how an Ananda devotee should live. And they're deeply concerned about other people. And I say all of these things because in the context of Ananda, it's self-evident. But you go to many other ashrams and spiritual organizations, it's not like that at all. And their responsibility is for the spiritual well-being of others. It is not the institution first. The institution is the spiritual well-being of others, and everything else is there to serve. Just exactly what Swami is saying here. People are more important than things, especially their spiritual welfare. So I say that because the tenor of every group endeavor is always a reflection of the spirit of its leadership. When there was a weird false lawsuit filed against our community in Italy, and it was filed like 2 months after Swami had moved from Italy to India. And even though he was a named defendant, his health collapsed as soon as he got to India, and his doctors absolutely refused to allow him to fly back to Italy. Swami was extremely distraught about that because he said, and he said it repeatedly, I am the leader of the organization. If there has been anything that has been done wrong, it is my responsibility. And he was stricken that people in Italy were being, in fact, even for a time, imprisoned, if you can believe it, but only, fortunately, for a week. But when they went into prison, we didn't know. He was just beside himself that people would be imprisoned when he felt that he was the one responsible. And it took a couple of years. Actually, it took 7 years to sort the thing out until it was completely wiped off the books. In Italy, you can be more than innocent. It can be declared that there was never any basis and it was a frivolous, false litigation from the beginning, which is what happened. But at the very end of it, Swamiji was able finally to be in Italy and to speak to the judge. And he said, I am responsible. He said, if punishment is warranted, which I do not believe it is, I am the one to be punished because I am the director of this enterprise. And it wasn't, it was an affirmation of what Swami says. If there's malfeasance within it, it's the spirit of the leader. Every entity, every organization reflects the spirit of the leader. But it was also him demonstrating what true leadership really is. I will take responsibility. Leadership is not position. Leadership is, I will take responsibility. And if you watch the human dynamics, very often the actual leader in a situation may not be the one who holds the position, but it's the one with the magnetism to inspire others with the vision and the willingness to say, if it needs to be done, I will do it. And it's just, I will do it. That's what true leadership is. So Swami goes on to say, I myself came to this understanding after trying for years to deny it, that the group is always the reflection of the leader. I had the job of organizing groups under the coordination of an international headquarters. My endeavor was to free those groups from uncertain dependence on any one leader. It was only gradually that I came to see that I had been working against a simple reality of human nature. Rules and procedures are no substitute for creative leadership. And it was then I realized that leadership means cultivating people, not abstractions. The specific example that Swami went through is just worth repeating. He was in charge of the meditation centers for Self-Realization Fellowship after Master's passing. And so when Master was alive, of course, he ran everything directly. As the guru, he was in direct contact with all of those he'd put in positions of leadership. But after his Master's passing in 1952, they had to think about organizing it in different ways. And Swamiji was young, but he was also intuitively capable, and he was given the responsibility for coordinating those groups. And he could see, that it was so uncertain, as he put it. If you had a good leader, it worked. And so he wanted to set up rules. So he set up things like there would be guidelines for what people would talk about. There would be guidelines for how people would do things. And in that way, he hoped to create a system that would be self-perpetuating, that any individual could step into, and the magnetism of it would continue. Swami was always bold in his experiments. And so there was one, the best meditation group they had was in Oakland, and it was run by one of Master's disciples. Well, all the leaders were Master's disciples at that point, direct disciples. Her name was Kamala Silva. She's passed from this world now. And it was just had a wonderful spirit, and everything that they did was always full of happiness and attunement, and people were coming to the path. In every way, it was a wonderful center. Swami started instituting these rules, which started dictating to her how she had to do things. And her response to it was to quietly resign, because she didn't want to create disharmony. At the same time, she knew she couldn't follow what he was suggesting. And Swami said, from night to morning, it went from being the best center to the worst. Or at least, I don't know if it was the worst, but it went from being the best to not being the best, because it was her spirit that animated it. It was her example of what it meant to be disciple. It was her magnetic capacity to uplift people spiritually, which made them all want to come. And you can't do that by rules. Everybody sits here, everybody chants for this period of time, everybody reads these words. As Swami said, when you make enough rules, you can keep the bottom from falling too low, but you also will keep the top from rising too high. And he realized quite simply it was a mistake. And he just had to accept that what you need to do is you need to cultivate leaders. Because if you cultivate leaders, not systems, systems are fine, but any system will work with a good leader. And as Swami says, no system will work with a bad leader, because it just won't. And then he said, leadership means cultivating people, not abstractions. Abstractions being exactly how should this service run, how many minutes should the chants be, how should we go through with all the chants, what reading should we have over here. These are abstractions. You get all these abstractions in order, but you don't have human vitality. You just have abstractions in order. But if you cultivate people, if you help people to be in tune, to be instruments, then you really have something. For as the leader is, so will the group be. A good leader attracts good subordinates, or in some cases simply magnetizes them so that they become good. You see, of course, dynamic people will want to work with other dynamic people. Dynamic people will not be inclined to tie themselves down to unmagnetic systems. A bad leader, on the other hand, can dissipate the magnetism of even the best team. No one with spirit, moreover, would remain longer than absolutely necessary. under the direction of anyone completely lacking in spirit. There was a very interesting situation in the early developing years of Ananda, when it was first just developing beyond Ananda village. And I was, Swamiji sent me out to be a representative of Ananda to various other cities that were just sort of beginning to coalesce around these ideas. And in the Northwest, there was a very dynamic man who was very inspired by Ananda and by Master's teachings, and he wanted to serve, and he established a group. He established a group all on his own. He was had a lot of personal charisma, a lot of willpower, a lot of intelligence and talents, and he pulled together a very strong group. There was a solid 30 people involved in that group. So by the time I came on the scene, the group was already operating very well in Master's name, and in the name of Ananda. He had used the name Ananda, he called it that. And I came in and I helped. I initiated people as disciples. Swami had just put into place the idea that any of us could initiate others as disciples of Master, so we had some lovely times together. But this man was also very big in his thinking, and so he incorporated his entity as an Ananda group. All of this was just when we were all beginning and hadn't even really thought through any of the abstractions related to this. And then he appointed himself spiritual director for life. So now he was having a legal Ananda group in which he was spiritual director for life. And there was just something about this that seemed a little more than we wanted. So Swami invited this man. I went to Swami and said, "Sir, I'm way beyond my portfolio. I mean, I've just started here, and I'm not quite sure what to do about this whole situation." Swami invited the gentleman to come down for lunch, come down to Ananda village to visit with him, and I cooked lunch, and we all sat around for many hours and talked through all aspects of it. And at the very end of it, Swami just said to him, having listened to him and commented, and they didn't argue, but Swami gave him honest feedback on various points. But at the end of it, Swami said, as it happens, I, Kriyananda, am spiritual director for life of Ananda itself. So if you want to be spiritual director for life, maybe you need to use another name rather than Ananda. That's all he said to him. And so the man went back, he respected Swami, and he changed the name. He kept his position, he kept everything the same, but he changed the name because it was just, he stepped over that one line too far. But all of that was true, and it was easy to criticize him, and eventually we developed an Ananda group, and he went in another direction. And it never came to an explosion, but it sort of sorted itself out. But after the man left, Swami said to all of us, and it was self-evident what the difficulties were. There was a certain amount of egocentricity in this man's desire to serve. He was sincere, and he was also, there was a little too much personal ego, too much personal stake in it. But Swami said, first, I'd always rather have a man with spunk than someone with no energy. And he says, anyone with spunk is just going to go ahead and do what they feel to do. They're not going to sit and wait to be told what to do. He said, I'd always rather have someone with spunk than someone who doesn't have energy. I mean, that was a very interesting point. Swamiji would rather take energy that's really there and try to move it in the right direction than have a bunch of people without the imagination or the energy or the courage to make anything happen. I mean, that was the way Swami saw it. And it was important for all of us to understand that. I found myself later involved with another set of people who had started out being Ananda leaders, and they were now leading a group that was more in line with what we were doing, and I was still the liaison, and I was going up there often. And then when I went up to visit, it turned out that the man who was in charge had changed the energization exercises. The energization exercises are one of the fundamental techniques that Master gave us on the path to Kriya, and he was now teaching them differently. And by now I'd had more experience, and I just had to say to him, you know, the road that we call Ananda, because of Swami's way of doing it, it's very, very broad. You know, you can have a lot of variation because he'd introduced a lot of variations, but all of them were within the boundaries. I said, but when you start changing the basic techniques that Master taught us, you have fallen off the edge. And either you have to bring it back, or you can't continue to call yourself an Ananda leader because it's just too much. And in that particular case, he chose to resign. And so for the second or third time, the group, because it was the same city, the group went down to zero again. But we had to, better to go to zero and be faithful to the vision that Swami had given us, because Swamiji was the spiritual director for life. And it was his point of view that had to be followed. And in this case, I didn't have to draw Swami into it because I knew enough to be able to handle it. And it was a semi-harmonious dissolution. But because I couldn't explain it clearly enough for the person to accept it. But there you have it. So, where are we? So here he says, so they become good. A bad leader, on the other hand, can dissipate the magnetism of even the best team. No one with spirit, moreover, would remain longer than necessary under the direction completely lacking in spirit. He said, ego games are not so easy to dismiss as they are to ridicule. That's a very powerful phrase. Ego games are not so easy to dismiss as they are to ridicule. You can make fun of it, you can denigrate it, but arrogance indeed is the first temptation of leadership. So Swami's also saying to us now, don't just think because you give lip service to the idea of humility and not getting caught up in the personal energy of what you're doing. He says delusion is much more subtle than that. And this is extremely important for anyone in positions of responsibility, because sometimes you accidentally back yourself into a corner, and then pride blinds you to what you've done, or pride convinces you that there's a principle involved and that you have to hold to your position. Let's see how much Swami goes into this, but believe me, I've been caught in that before. You sort of start out thinking you're on some principle and you transfer over to just defending your position and not wanting to be embarrassed by having to admit your mistake. And all of a sudden you're someplace you never intended to be. Arrogance, indeed, is the first temptation of leadership. Not to be so tempted, furthermore, is not even necessarily a good sign in a potential leader. For whereas arrogance must be, in fact, tempered if leadership is to be effective, unwillingness to lead may simply be an inborn trait and unalterable. One who cannot come to terms with the thought of being a leader is someone whose natural mode of self-expression can only lie in some other field of action. Now, there's a lot that's there that I'm going to have to postpone until next week. Next week, because today in my recording is Thursday. So I'm going to leave it as a cliffhanger, and we'll just stay here and find out if the heroine is actually going to get run over by the train or whether the hero will come to untie her in time. God bless you, my friends.